All right, so we are working our way through chapters 7 and 8 today in the CES textbook. So first chapter, you'll notice my PowerPoint is pretty sparse, but I'm copying some notes from the standard edition textbook because this chapter is mostly identical. The only thing that I'm probably going to have to add in this corrective variation is SMART goals. They did a way better job in the corrective book. I don't know how that happened, but they took a little bit longer to get into like SMART goals, which is something you totally want to talk about in a first session. I mean, like you always want to ask like a client, like, hey, what are your goals? But they kind of get into this idea of like you can lay some breadcrumbs down in your first session of like, hey, those goals sound really, really great, but then you're like, what? If I might suggest, we can make those a little bit more specific and then like help your client reword their goal a little bit. That's always like kind of a cool thing to do on a beginning session because like it shows that you have like, beyond your physiology stuff, beyond your motivational stuff, like you're also there to like, coach your clients in a way that is going to be effective to reach those goals. So I'll have a client that says like, they want to lose, they want to lose weight. And I'll be like, let's get a little bit more specific about that, right? How much, let's say we want to lose fat and then like, let's maybe say do you want to gain any muscle? Like, do you have interest in that? And they're like, no, not really. I'm like, okay, great. If they're afraid of getting too bulky, which is a classic people sometimes say. I will eventually try to talk them out of that opinion, but if we say like, okay, cool. So we know that we have like a fat loss goal instead of just a weight loss goal. It's like how much, if you what body fat percentage do you want to get to, or like what is this? And that way, like I'm just getting a little bit more specific about them. So instead of saying like a goal that's very general, like I want to lose weight, it might be I want to lose 10 pounds of body fat. Right. And so just that little bit like instantly makes that goal a little bit more instructive. So what I always tell people, like I always tell people like a good goal should be instructive. You know what I mean? Like it should almost like when you read it, you're like, oh, I kind of know what to do just based on like reading what I want to achieve. That's a really good SMART goal. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll probably tack that on at the end of this, but we're gonna work our way through like client intake. Legal and ethical responsibilities, things that we're allowed to assess for, things we're super not allowed to assess for, and then talk a little about that coaching stuff at the end. So before we kind of dive into this side of things, when we look at like the types of assessments that you're going to be like performing, let me see, I'm just going to copy my slide here. And I'll take it over to Paint. I'll make my own little chart here. You sort of look at like what this is. Your client intake. This is really just going to be like most of your what we call subjective data, right? And so like subjective data is just the immeasurable stuff, right? Like I've said that something that I kind of always say when I'm talking about like assessments and stuff is I talk about this idea that like when I first started being a trainer, I like wasn't super interested in subjective data. You study this stuff, you get really heavy into like the physiology and the biology and stuff, and it's like you're like, nah, I like the science, the hard numbers and stuff like that. And like I still think those are incredibly, incredibly important. Like somebody's body weight going from 220 to 219 to 218 to 200, like that's a measurable thing. It's like, progress is going in the direction that my client wanted. So we like objective data. But what I started to find, like as I actually started working with clients, and getting out of just studying and like actually doing it in real life, is that like the subjective, immeasurable stuff, like while it may not necessarily have like a number on it, right? It's still very important because it's the why behind the what. Like if your client is like, I want to, be able to squat 135 pounds. I just want to get under the bar for the first time with like two plates, one on either side. And it's like, cool, that's a really good, objective, measurable goal. But like the subjective goal of like, I've never exercised before, and I read that I need to do this because like, I want to start getting, back into let's say basketball, like, and it's like the why behind the what. It's like, oh, okay, so they might be motivated by like that 135 that they're trying to hit, but they're gonna be really motivated by the like, hey, this is gonna help you in any pickup games that you might start playing. So subjective data, really, really important. That is where we're gonna spend, this is gonna be our first PowerPoint today. But eventually we will work our way into the next chapter, which is going to be static posture assessments. That's our next, we're going to get into that today as well. And that is going to be our first bit of objective data. So there we'll get objective, right? And really we're gonna spend most of our time in objective data, right? Like the same thing is true of like movement assessments, right? Those are also going to be objective. And then we'll get into targeted mobility assessments. That's going to be new for everyone, which will be really kind of fun. And that's going to be objective. So again, like most of our data, right? Like most of what we gather for the purposes of like, training our clients is objective, right? But we start with like the subjective stuff. We start with this because it's going to give us the why behind all of this what, right? Was the why behind all this what, right? And so we figure out like what's going on with the posture. Maybe they have rounded shoulders, right? Then we start making them do like or maybe they have really good static posture, but once they start like moving through different ranges of movement, they're using the wrong muscles to do certain bits of work, right? So okay, well that's not so good, right? So statically they were okay, movement wise they were not. And then eventually we have like targeted mobility assessments. And mobility assessments are where we try to draw that muscle through a specific range of movement. And that's going to tell us whether or not they have a stability problem or a mobility problem. So I can kind of get to the heart of like, oh, it's this particular muscle, right? So this is going to be kind of fun because nobody's actually, at least with me, we haven't ever talked about this, but the targeted mobility stuff is it's like, okay, I saw during your squat, in a movement, or I saw during a static assessment, not much, right? Like everybody looked pretty good. Then I had you start squatting and we saw just like a little bit of dysfunction, with a movement assessment. It's like, okay, they were leaning forward a little bit too much, right? So that's probably tight calves, right? So then we can do like a targeted mobility assessment and we can actually measure, how effectively we try to draw their calf through a specific range of movement. If it can go through that range of movement, it's like, oh, okay, well, after I did the targeted mobility assessment, that proved the calves actually aren't that tight. Let's go back and take a look at that and see if like their abdominals and their core, or let's see if their hip flexors and the lumbo-pelvic hip complex are actually the things that are tight. So we might do some mobility assessments there. So we do a mobility assessment on the hip. That tells us there it is, right? We saw some tightness there. So that's drawing them downwards, right? So that'll be really fun. This is going to be our lesson. We're going to do this on Wednesday. And we'll get a chance to practice this on Thursday in class. So that'll be really fun. And then we'll have all of our assessment stuff done and then we can start working in program design. So today we're just starting with these first two bits right here. And then obviously like at the end, all of this is also gonna be really important because like usually this is done during your first session. So this is also where you're gonna start establishing your ability to communicate with your clients and build trust and rapport and all that stuff. So we're gonna go ahead and start off with what we call like, in an initial session with a client, there's two types of initial sessions. You will either have the like client already signed up, they are working with you, they're under, they've got sessions, they're under, not contract, I guess. I mean, some places are under contract, but they're signed up with you, right? So maybe they just automatically did that. So you need to start that first session off by getting all the data you need to write your client a really good routine. So it might start your very first session as like a client intake session. Or more likely what'll happen is you are going to work in a place that offers free 1-hour assessments or free first hour of training. They give like one personal training session for free. So you might start there And if you have something like that, well, then your first session, how are you going to write a routine if you don't know anything about somebody? So you're probably going to spend that free first session as if you analyze what it is, it's a sales pitch, right? And that's at the end of the day, that's what it is. You are pitching your services. And so you're going to do an assessment to gather the data you need to write the program to hopefully train the client on that program. So this is really like our first step. So we're going to start with, some screening where we just ask some subjective questions. That's going to move into what we call the PAR-Q. The PAR-Q is going to be our physical activity readiness questionnaire. I think you guys should remember that. Eventually we get into the general and medical history, which we've got some detailed notes over here. Not so detailed on the PowerPoints. And then eventually we get into medical history as well, where it's like, yeah, tell me about any surgeries you might have. Like walk me through if you've got any scar tissue we deal with. And then we wrap all that subjective stuff up with asking them for a couple goals. And ideally, if we can, like I said, we can restructure we're not going to set new goals. It's crazy important that you don't do that. Like, don't take your client's goals and be like, nah, it's not a good one. Do this instead. Don't do that. But eventually we do want to get we want to make their goals a little smarter. I don't mean their goals are dumb. I just mean like we want them to follow this system here: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and deadline oriented or time bound goals. So let's go ahead and take a look here. We got our little intro, and then I'll piggyback on that. That's not framed correctly. Get over here. This is actually pretty brief, so this will be good. Yep. All right, little AI video for you guys.
Everybody has a body capable of improved alignment, function, and mobility. By learning to work through the corrective exercise assessment flow, you can change people's lives for the better through your role as a corrective exercise specialist. As we work through this information, it's important to remember that your role is not to treat musculoskeletal injuries, but to correct and optimize movement through exercises designed for each individual. Corrective exercise strategies can also be applied after an injury and after rehabilitation is complete. But in that case, it's important to be sure the client has received medical treatment and healthcare clearance to return to normal activity. Your roadmap will be the Corrective Exercise Specialist, or CES, assessment flow. Assessments are crucial in the design of a safe, individualized corrective exercise program. The process begins with the client intake screen, followed by a static assessment. Next, a series of movement assessments are conducted, and then, based on the findings from the static and movement assessments, mobility assessments are used to refine the observations and pinpoint strategies as you create programs using the corrective exercise continuum. Now, we'll take a closer look at each step of the assessment flow, starting with the client intake screen. First impressions are important. Just as much as you'll be evaluating the client, this is your chance to create a positive first impression. The client intake screen should be as thorough and detailed as possible and should include a physical activity readiness questionnaire, or PAR-Q, as well as questions about their lifestyle, occupation, and hobbies. You'll also discuss the client's medical history and health and fitness goals. Make sure to spend some one-on-one time with the client to go over the information, talk about goals, and develop that personal connection. It's important to build up your client's motivation and commitment to change. This is the first step to a long and successful relationship. Next, you'll test your visual observation skills with the static postural assessment. Now, the word static might make you think of stillness or immobility, but it actually takes a coordinated set of isometric contractions to hold a position. So, static posture provides our first clues about our client's overall mobility and neuromuscular control. To start, you'll have your clients remove their shoes and then just stand there in what the client feels is their most neutral, relaxed position.
So always lose the shoes because shoes are terrible. And, make sure that you got them in a neutral position.
That is their static posture. Typically, you will start at the feet and travel up to the head, observing your client from anterior, lateral, and posterior viewpoints. You'll compare your client's posture to the clinical, ideal standing posture and take note of any deviations representing static postural impairments. Now, like the song says, toe bone connected to the foot bone, and, well, you get the picture. Point being, every part of the body is related to another part. To structure this observation, NASM recommends the systematic use of kinetic chain checkpoints. These are the major joint regions of the body, including the foot and ankle, knee, lumbopelvic hip complex, or LPHC, the shoulders and thoracic spine, and the head and cervical spine. We'll get into further detail on all the things to look for in some videos down the road. For now, we are moving on to an overview of postural distortions. Because everything in the body is connected, things don't tend to just pop up one at a time. They are typically grouped into patterns based on how they relate. More than likely, you will encounter some common patterns in clients. Two of the most well-known postural classification paradigms are Yonda's postural distortion syndromes and Kendall's posture classifications. Think of Yonda and Kendall as a couple of helpful friends who can help point out things to look for during the static assessment process. You can break these down even further into Yonda's lower crossed syndrome, or LCS, Yonda's upper crossed syndrome, or UCS, Yonda's layered crossed syndrome, Kendall's lordotic posture, Kendall's flat back posture, sway back posture, and Kendall's kyphosis lordosis posture. And again, remember, this is just an overview. We'll get into more detail a little later. Moving on to movement assessments. These are the cornerstone of a comprehensive assessment process. Optimal movement requires the integrated functioning of the entire human movement system, otherwise known as HMS. Due to repetitive movement patterns, injury, disease, or a sedentary lifestyle, dysfunction can occur in one or more regions of the body. Movement assessments should be completed in a systematic order, starting with the least challenging and progressing in line with your client's abilities. Their functional capacity, severity of compensations, and personal fitness goals will all inform your decisions about which movement assessments to perform. Movement assessments can be grouped into three categories: transitional assessments, loaded assessments, and dynamic assessments. Transitional movement assessments involve movement without a change in the base of support, with both feet on the ground. They allow you to assess an individual's dynamic posture, quality, and control of movement and joint alignment. As the client performs each specific movement pattern, any observed compensations point you to possible movement impairments at each of the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. The transitional assessments use the client's body weight and include the overhead squat, modified overhead squat, split squat, and single leg squat. Next, we'll take a look at loaded movement assessment. Here, you'll observe your client's dynamic posture with an additional source of resistance. This kind of assessment directly relates movements we use each day, everything from pushing to pulling, an overhead press, trunk rotation, weighted squats, hinge exercises, split stance, and single leg exercises. Loaded movement assessments can be done separately as part of the client assessment process or within the client's workouts, depending on their comfort level. Loaded movement assessments include loaded squat, standing push, standing pull, and standing overhead dumbbell press. The optional and more advanced dynamic movement assessments involve movement with a change in the base of support, things like walking and jumping. Dynamic assessments can be used in two ways. The first is as a method of refinement and confirmation for what you saw in the transitional assessments. Another use is to ramp things up for more advanced clients that are finding things like overhead squats too easy or that have sports performance-related goals. Just be sure your clients are ready to progress so that they maintain the best possible form. Let's head into the home stretch of our overview with mobility assessments. These assessments confirm findings from earlier stages and further pinpoint areas that need attention. Long story short, mobility assessments answer the question, is restricted motion and movement impairment primarily due to overactive shortened muscles or by underactive lengthened muscles?
Really quickly, a better way to say that, and I'll repeat this again on Monday, but when it comes to mobility assessments, he said, is a restriction caused by tight overactive muscles or weak underactive muscles? Another really good way to say that is, do they have a mobility problem? Meaning, yeah, tight muscles are keeping them from moving, or do they have a stability problem? Which is like, basically they have the range of movement. Like if you were to grab their arm or leg or whatever body part and draw it through that range of motion, you'd feel some restriction, but you wouldn't feel like a crazy amount of restriction. You could move them and they'd be like, yeah, that's pretty comfortable. I can move like that. But if you ask them to contract their muscles and draw into that range of motion on their own without assistance, they wouldn't be able to access it. That's an underactive problem, right? So they have like a stability muscle problem. And that's, like I said, it's kind of piggyback. It's kind of setting us up for Monday's lesson, Monday and Tuesday. But yeah, that's a better way to think of that.
If movement impairments are found in previous assessment stages, but your mobility assessments don't show any range of motion limitations at those impaired kinetic chain checkpoints, it probably means the culprit behind that impairment is related to underactive lengthened muscles more so than overactive shortened muscles. In this case, you can streamline your client's program design, focusing on muscular activation and movement pattern integration. If movement impairments identified in previous assessment stages are related to limited range of motion or mobility restriction during your mobility assessments, then flexibility should be addressed for the relevant overactive shortened muscles. Once you have made your discoveries in this part of the process, you can streamline your client's program design, focusing on muscular activation and movement pattern integration. Another thing you may run into is mobility restriction, where a joint doesn't move through its full range of motion. Be sure to approach mobility assessments within the context of the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. If the client doesn't demonstrate any static malalignments or movement impairments at a kinetic chain checkpoint, specific mobility testing for that area is probably not necessary. It's also important to remember that if you think there are actual structural issues, it might be time to have your client address those with an allied healthcare professional. Pain doesn't automatically come from musculoskeletal dysfunction, so corrective exercise specialists shouldn't assume that if your client reports joint pain, that corrective exercise will address it. Once you've gathered all the data on your client, it's time to implement corrective exercise programming, where you'll work together through phases 1 through 4 of the corrective exercise continuum. Greater than the sum of its parts, the corrective exercise continuum leverages evidence-based strategies rooted in the principles of human movement science. But the truly ideal program extends beyond the complexities of science. This is your opportunity to become a fitness detective, to uncover all the facets of your client, and then utilize and employ a variety of techniques, tools, and tactics within a client-centric program that you design just for them. At the end of the day, a perfectly designed program that is never done helps no one. The perfect program is the one your client can consistently adhere to and meets their goals and expectations. So, there you have it. A thoughtful assessment process is the first step in optimizing your client's movement quality to create lasting results and ultimately giving them a better quality of life.
Okay. All right. So, like I said, we are going to work our way into our client intake first, right? So if you go to NASM's website, you can find this available for download. Obviously, there's, you'll also find versions of this in your textbook, but way easier than, Xeroxing them. I will say, I don't like the way their website works now. It's easier to just Google it than it is to go on the website itself. So scroll down here. Man, they have added a ton of these mini courses. That's a lot of new stuff, actually. That's kind of cool. But they go down here under assessment forms. You're going to find the first thing we're going to find is the PAR-Q. And the PAR-Q is always where you want to start because this is what is going to protect you legally and protect your client as well, because it's making you ask questions that could tell you if your client has something that should prevent them from exercising, right? So we look here and we see, answer yes or no to the following questions. Now, in the old version of the PAR-Q, if anybody in here has worked with these before, let me see if I can find the original PAR-Q. PAR-Q. Let's see if I can actually find this. Where is the old one? There it is. Here's the NASM old one. And it was just these 7 questions. And that was it, and it's the same 7 questions as before. They actually start off the same. But it's basically all questions related to like cardiorespiratory or like metabolic or bone dysfunction, so that like you can determine whether or not it is safe for you to begin exercising with your client today, right? So it's like, has your doctor ever said that you have a heart condition or high blood pressure? Yes or no. Pain in your chest during physical activity? Yes or no. Loss of balance or dizziness in the last 12 months? Yes or no. And so you basically work your way through all of those. Now, originally, like in this version, and this is very pixelated, so I doubt you guys can see this, but it says, if you answered yes to any of the questions, please consult your physician before engaging in physical activity. So basically, if they said yes to anything back in the day, you kind of just be like, all right, well, you need to go talk to your doctor before like I'm going to be comfortable working with you, or, before I know that it's, your doctor's going to need to clear you for exercise. And that's like a really safe way. Like, I'm not knocking that. I think that's really great. But the problem was, you would run into this a lot, if you had that response, that reaction, you would have a client who was like, I came here. Yeah, like I came here because my doctor told me to start exercising. Like it's like, and it's like, do you have proof of that? Do you have like a note from your doctor? And it's like, no, I didn't ask my doctor for a note to get a gym membership. And like people were real annoyed about it. So there needed to be a little bit of a change. So eventually so if they say no, if they say no to everything, you're good to go. Just like, go take that person and do burpees. So they'd sign this, and that basically all of this says is like, everything I said up here is true. The participant declaration section. I am not lying. It's what this big green section says. If they answer yes, right, and they still want to, continue exercising, say you move on to this much more detailed version down here, where you can get a little bit more specific about everything. That again is directing us as the fitness professional to asking more specific questions related to their physical health. And then we get down here and they can sign this other participant declaration section that basically says like, all right, that's everything I need to know. But basically this second section says, I want to exercise today because my doctor told me to go get more physical activity. I just don't have a note, because who asks their doctor for a note for a gym member? It's like that's basically what that second section says. So you can sign that and then still continue to work with your client today. And then, the nice thing about that is that like now your client now you and your client are both on the same page about like what they may experience during this training session, um, and let's say something happens, heaven forbid, but let's say something happens to your client, right? Let's say that they have a heart attack going up the stairs, right? You haven't even started working with them yet, right? Or let's say they do, you have started working with them, right? Well, if they decide to come after you because, what's the narrative going to be there? They're gonna be like, oh, well, this fitness professional, quote unquote, worked me too hard and gave me a heart attack, right? Um, so now you have, by doing the Part Q, you have proof that you did everything in your power. I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, there's no way to actually, unless you have like hooked your client up to an EKG machine, there's no way to tell if their heart is truly capable of exercise. You have perfectly healthy people who might have heart disease, they've never had a problem before, and then all of a sudden have a heart attack or stroke or something out of nowhere. That can happen. It can happen to any of us, you know? So you like what will happen is if they try to say like you pushed me too hard, right? You have a piece of paper, you have a whole contract basically saying that you did everything in your power to check for that. And it still happened, right? And so that proves that like, you did not have the tools or capacity to learn of this thing and you did your best. And so like that basically legally protects you. Um, Oh, hold on, my internet's slowing down a little bit. So that's the whole purpose of a Part Q. It's going to make sure that like you are proving that you did everything in your power to keep your client safe. You have a piece of paper stating, I, as a professional, made sure I'm keeping my clients safe. And then you have certification and NASM's name behind you as well, and you have your entire employer's insurance and stuff. Like there's a lot of things that also legally protect you, especially here in the state of California. Like a lot of people talk about how like California is an easy place to get sued and stuff, but like that's really not true as long as you actually do your paperwork. So yeah, that's our Part Q. So we move through that, it's and well, let's stop with that. One second, let's go back. So the physical activity readiness questionnaire, this is the homework style questions. This is your definition you guys need to know. They're questions directed towards detecting any possible, and it says cardiorespiratory dysfunction. It actually has some questions related to like bone stuff as well. I don't know why like they put such a big emphasis on cardiorespiratory. I guess because heart attacks are probably the most dangerous. But it's funny. This has been the definition for like 10 years. And I always find that really funny because it's like there's other stuff in there, but I don't know. That's how the question is going to be on your test. If they answered yes to any of the questions on the Part Q, get medical clearance from the doctor before engaging in physical activity. That used to be true again, but you can also continue with the second half of that Part Q as well. So eventually we'll work our way through that, and then we're going to go into the general/medical history questionnaire, or as it is available for download on NASM's website, the lifestyle and health history handout. So this is going to have a lot of the same, you're going to put the same name, age, sex, height, weight, date, all that stuff on top of the questionnaire. But then you're going to start getting into the specific questions of like, what is your client most interested in? What is it that they're trying to accomplish, right? So you can see here, like, questions like, hey, what exercise do you currently partake in, right? I want to know that. I want to know that because like it might tell me what kind of athlete you are. It might tell me what your interests are. There's a lot that I want to know about that, right? Do you run? Do you lift weights? Do you do group exercise? Do you like to go for hikes and walks? I mean, just telling you from like, a little bit of personal experience, that first question there can really kind of give you a good idea of like what your client's likes and dislikes are, like if they say like, yeah, do group exercise. I'm like, oh, great. Like what type of group exercise? I'm like, oh, I'm a big like Zumba person. I'm like, awesome. That tells me that like they want to work out that's like fun and engaging. And they do kind of probably like that little bit of community aspect as well. Just any group exercise. CrossFit, that's a big one. When I hear like, people say they're like an ex-CrossFitter, you know. Um, I don't jump to the conclusion. It's like, oh, they're injured. You know, I don't try to jump straight to that conclusion or anything. But I do jump to the like, oh, they really like the community aspect, and they probably like they have maybe a little bit of a competitive streak, and they like a lot of variety. You know, like those are the things that you kind of want to hear. So really, really helpful to kind of figure that out the gate. How many days a week do you engage in at least 60 minutes of moderate intensity activity? Now, when I ask that question, I'm also going to try to define the term moderate. So I'll say like, how often do you get close to out of breath? You know, like I don't need you to necessarily be like huffing and puffing, but you know, you can kind of hear a little bit of extra breathing while you're talking. How often do you get into a mode of exercise like that, where it's like, you know, it just sounds a little breathier than it might have if you were having a normal conversation, right? If that's my sort of like that's the goalposts for, in my opinion, like moderate intensity activity, right? Um, on a scale of 0 to 10, how important are the following fitness goals to you? Weight loss, muscle gain, sports performance, health improvement. That's also going to give us a really good idea there. Eventually, we work our way into some diet questions. How do you consider your diet to be generally healthy? I love this question because like you're putting a 0 to 10 on like how healthy somebody thinks their diet is, and then you're gonna have some follow-up questions here, and it might give you an idea of like, you know, like they ask when you ask a general question, like if I was like, you know, hey, Lisa, do you think you're healthy? You know, like that's a very general question. And but if I follow up with like specific questions related to the concept of healthy, you might find that like those two things don't match up. Like you're like, yeah, my salt intake is really high, my fat intake is really high, my sugar intake is really high, and I'm not very good at, you know, managing my temptations with junk food. I have alcohol and energy drinks, you know, 7 days a week. And it's like a minute ago they said it's like, yeah, I think I'm relatively healthy. My diet's pretty good. You know? And it's like, okay, you know, like so what you're you know the client you have are weird example here, but you know the clients you have are my parents. Like if you asked Mark and Brenda Thompson whether or not their diet is pretty healthy, they would absolutely say yes. Like guaranteed. And then if you were to like look at you know, like the actual things that they're eating, it's like, oh, and it's like, well, we don't do that all the time. And then they're like, oh, okay, so you don't have it. And then they would be like, they would say they don't have like these unhealthy things all the time, but like my parents are eating pounds of red meat a week, you know, like that's it's something we've been working on. So you know, like that's what's interesting, right? Like their salt intake's actually much better than it used to be. But the sugar intake is off the charts. Um, luckily, they seem to both sides of my family happen to come from like diabetes resistant bloodlines, but like which is lucky for them because their cravings are through the roof. Um, I'm like looking at a picture of my parents like on the desk here, and I'm like, Anyway, so you'll get that sometimes. That's one thing that I really like about this diet section is like it asks a very general question first and then gets into a specific question second. And you as the expert can kind of like see, do those things match up? If they do, that person, you know, and if they say like, yeah, I have a really bad diet, and then they're like, yep, fat's high, they understand, they have a pretty good understanding of what is healthy, right? Whereas like if you see it's kind of all over the place and like those things aren't matching up, it's telling you it's like, ooh, so they think they're healthy, but they also are aware that they're bringing in these things. So they don't really see those things as like a problem. And so now you can, again, like kind of have a better idea of like, okay, well, you know, one of the things we'll probably talk about during, you know, like time on the gym floor is like, let's talk about food. Let's talk about like what's healthy and maybe what's not. Um, then we got some questions related to lifestyle here. How well do you think you get enough sleep every day? Do you wake up feeling rested each day? Lord knows that's a big one for most of us. These things are killing us in terms of keeping us awake. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate your average level of stress? Like, do you see yourself as very stressed or not so stretched, stressed? And then like smoking or vaporizing. Uh, Smoking tobacco or smoking, it still does say tobacco. Really, I mean, in 2024, we've probably just got to throw just the word smoking in general in there. But smoking or vaping, like, is that a common thing, in your lifestyle? Yes or no? We just want to know about those things because, again, like, they do have like major health impacts, vaping included. I know vaping is the new kid on the block, and people are still trying to stand behind that argument of like, it hasn't been proven that it's bad for you yet. Which is true because it takes a long time to have things under the word proof when it comes to science. But talk to anyone who understands basic biology and they will tell you it's awful. So yeah, we want to know about it, right? Sorry, that's the most judgmental I'll get is just like, I'm like, if you want like the stuff that comes along with smoking and vaping, just put it through a different system in your body. Like, stop putting it through your lungs. That's all I ask. Stop lunging it. It will clog those tubes. That is the only thing that can happen. But then again, I've been working on this like freaking escape room, and yesterday I was like inhaling sawdust all day, which is also not good. So I put a big old like respirator on yesterday, and I was like, all right, I got to be better about using this dang thing. But yeah, and then we get into occupation. So I got some really good examples of occupation stuff here. I put these in here in particular because these are kind of interesting. They seem like really unimportant, banal things, right? So it's like, hey, here's some questions about like what your occupation's like. Like, first off, like, what do you do? We're trying to get to know our client. Like, some of these questions are not even related to like the science of human movement or health or anything like that. Sometimes it's also, you want to know your client. Like, you want to get close with your client so that you can have a positive impact on their health choices. So asking them like what their actual occupation is, that's big, right? And then ask him, does their occupation require extended periods of sitting? Seems like a weird question, but there's two reasons we ask that. One, it can tell us if they are sitting all day, which will likely lead to overactive or tight hip flexor muscles. And two, it tells us that they're not burning very much energy. So if they're like, yeah, I'm super active, I like to hike on the weekends, but like, I don't get it. I've been on this diet and I'm hiking every weekend, but like I'm still not, the weight's not coming off, or I don't really get it. And then you look at like their overall occupation, you find that like they're sitting like 8, 10 straight hours every single day, right? And it's like, ooh, chances are, yeah, you're getting you see like the image of yourself that you see is that of a very active person who's going out and like you're focused on the things that you do and on the weekends because that's the stuff that takes effort. That's stuff you enjoy, right? It's the stuff that you're not like zoning out through. It's the stuff that you're like actively engaged in. So it sits a little heavier in your brain, and you're probably giving the calorie burn that you get from the weekends a little more credit than it deserves as like a picture of your whole life. Um, and you're probably not giving as much credit to your job, which, like, it's not part of exercise. You're not really thinking about it much. So have clients that like have these very sedentary jobs. They don't really realize like how few calories that's going to burn throughout the day. So it explains like why they've followed the diet really strictly. They followed the exercise program really, really well, but they're still just not getting those results that they think they should be getting. And then again, like tight hip flexors. Does your occupation require extended periods of repetitive movement? That can lead to overactive shortened muscles. In this town, we run into a lot of like people in the industry and stuff. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with like gaffers or like sound guys, lighting guys, like all the like people who are like painters and like set designers and stuff. And it's like, whew, they're doing just a ton of like they're hanging stuff, making a set, and it's like their arms are up here all day, right? And you just get those like tight upper trap muscles. Working with people who might be soldering electronics all day, as somebody who has, adopted soldering in the last year, I'll tell you, every time I do it, I'm like working over the table with this. And then I'm like, I'm like trying to slowly, like finally stand up, and I'm like, oh my God. Yeah. Um, it's always incredibly humbling for me to be somebody who like exercises a lot and then like just go do something where I'm holding a little 1 pound something. Like Shantice, you were talking about this the other day, holding a little 1 pound something overhead for a long time. And then I take my arms down. I'm like, oh my God. Like, right. Humble, that emotion that I need to feel more often. you know,
No, there's this my favorite about like humbling or getting humbled in the gym is like you see the people where it's like, I'm gonna do the reverse flies today, or it's like I'm gonna do
yeah.
the cable flies today. I got this, 11 pounds, and then go to pull it, and the audio goes, sit your stupid ass down somewhere. You knew damn well you didn't have there's like a violin playing. It's like, oh yeah, I feel that. I feel that.
Yeah. People just don't understand torque. Like that's the thing. Like, you can do like you think about like why like a chest fly. You can be like 60 pounds, right? And then you do a reverse fly, which look, I'm doing a chest fly. Oh, now I'm doing a reverse fly. Oh, now I'm doing a chest fly again. It looks the same, right? Like, because it's identical movement. It's just backwards on the concentric eccentric, but your pectoral is this long, and then it's working against a lever that's this long, right? But your rhomboids are about that long. Like they're running just from the spine. So, that is, you can fit, what, 5 or 6 of those in this distance here. So you need to lift 5 or 6 times less weight. That's how torque works, it's math. But yeah, it's always humbling. I remember using that machine the very, very first time I ever did like a full session on my little fat freeze machine back there. First time I ever did it, I'm sitting there and I'm working on the client it takes an hour. It runs for 50 minutes. And but like, it's like it's got this goop on it, and like I don't want the little like cord little tube thing. I don't want that to like, get in the goop and get all messy and, make a mess. So I just like held it like this, and I like did it the whole time. And I just like had my arm up here. And I remember like spending an hour like that. And I'm like, hey, that was great. And then I just like went to go put this arm down for the first time in like an hour. And I was like, and it felt like I ripped my deltoid like off my arm, like because it was like so used to being just like contracted for an hour. And then I finally let go. And man, brutal, like, so yeah, repetitive movements, guys, they do a lot. If you're working on electronics, or if you're working a repetitive job or massage, man, I mean, like, I don't know how to look. This is advice that I'm going to give as somebody who would not do this, but like you definitely, and I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about when I say this, definitely want to, like, when you switch sides, use your other non-dominant hand. Like I'm very like right hand dominant, so I'm sure my instincts would be like to do a different posture on one side compared to the other, just so I can still keep using my right hand. But like, no, you got to be a little ambidextrous, because if you don't, you're not going to balance out. If you're leaning over one side here but you don't lean over this side here, it's like you're going to have QL problems. You're going to have you're going to start listing, you're going to start like walking like Igor. So yeah, repetitive movements, they are huge. Here's my favorite. Does your occupation require to wear shoes and an elevated heel? Now, I don't just ask occupation wise. I'm like, what kind of shoes do you like to wear? That's because look, modern shoes. We'll get some weird ones. Whenever I do that, I always get like a bunch of like weird goofy examples. Yeah, it's like, there we go. There's the Back to the Future Nikes. But you look at like a lot of like modern shoes, and they have like, we have slowly just determined that like this is attractive apparently. And so like we decided that like, even though feet are way more like spread out, and like, naturally they should have this like spread thing, right? We see this like pointed toe that we sort of just determined years ago. I was like, nope, that's what feet should look like. And so you get these like cramped, you see which barefoot, you see like, one of the big issues is like your toes can, they get cramped versus like being able to like spread out, which is what we want to see. I love when they do the x-ray version. You can see there, like they just look massively different. So, that's a big one. Or I'll ask my, clients about like, do they have an elevated heel? Because that's putting you into plantar flexion all day. In the same way that me holding up that tube made my arm get used to being in this position. Well, putting your heels up and like plantar flexing all day, yeah, leads to shortened calf muscles. It's one of the reasons, in my opinion, why calf muscles are so tight in so many people. And it's you want to hear me go like full conspiracy theorist, which I hate conspiracy theories. But like here's one that I'm slightly on board with. I blame mostly Nike. And that's hard for me to say as an Oregonian because I'm supposed to love Nike. um, but like Bill Bowerman, he invented the modern athletic shoe, and he put padding on the heel he was the first guy to ever do it. And man, we've just been ruined ever since. Tremendous running coach, built a dynasty, but he might have ruined everything. So yeah, that's a big one, elevated heels. And then like the mental stress, again, like if you're spending all day like this, if you drive a lot for work, if like that driving, just like, you get your shoulders up here, and that's like, hey, put those back down, like relax. I can't tell you how often I have to poke my clients. I'm like, all right, let's go do some rows. And I'm like, down, happens all the time. I got lost. Where am I? And then, okay, so then we move into, so we get the occupation stuff. We move into recreation. This is, again, like a little bit more of just like get to know your client. What are their likes? What are their dislikes? This provides really good information on like their general interests, and it tells you how to make your sessions more fun. I've had, you don't always have access to this if you're not like the one controlling your gym, but I love to be like, hey, favorite workout music, hook me up. Right. And I can throw that, and that's just going to make the session a little bit more fun. I had a client who I can't remember what happened. We were just using like radio, it was like Spotify, and I was like, put it on this person radio, because it'll make like a random playlist based on whatever artist you give it. And I remember both of us were like working out, and they were like, "What is this?" And I was like, "I don't know." And I went over, and it was like a parody. It was like not a parody song, but like it's like a remix, And it was. Have you guys ever heard of Girl Talk? Anybody know Girl Talk? I think it's an artist, not a band officially.
Well, I thought it was a podcast.
Is it a song or a group?
It's a group. I think it's a person, but I think they call themselves Girl Talk. They're like a DJ. But there probably is a podcast by the way, as I'm sure, with a name like that. But yeah, if you look Girl Talk, yeah, it's a DJ, and what they do is they take like popular songs, and then they'll either do like mashups where they'll put them together, and so it'll be like the beat from this song, but like the lyrics from another. And it's cool. Like the music's really fun. But I remember like that came up randomly, and we were both like, "What is this? Like that's the music from this, but there's something else." I am not brave enough to play this on my YouTube video because I'm sure it will get flagged. The NASM stuff, I don't think NASM's hunting, but so I'm a little more confident on showing those. But look up Girl Talk. It's kind of cool, and it's like they do like mashups, So for fun, again, my clients' likes and dislikes, that was close enough to music that they liked. So every session that became a thing. We like went through the Girl Talk albums, like we were like, let's do this, and then we ended up finding more mashup music, and it was just like fun. It's like a weird thing to do during our sessions. Took my client's brain out of, the burpees that I was making them do, like made them sweat a little more easily. You know what I mean? Like it made their life a little more fun. So the recreation stuff, like, if your client's a golfer, good Lord, I'm sure that's the only thing they're ever going to talk about because that is how everybody is with freaking golf. I spent the whole weekend talking about golf.
I don't see the point of golf.
What's that, Yasmin?
I don't see the point of golf.
Oh,
everybody fight me. It's like I generally don't see the point of it.
It is a very weird sport. Not barely a sport. It's a game. It is a backyard game that somehow gets to take up real estate. Sorry if I'm offending any golfers out there. But yeah, anyway, if they like golf, they're gonna love rotational movements and things like that that you can throw into your workout. So this is a good place to get some questions, right? So we do that. And then eventually we work our way into their medical history, right? We want to know if they have any past injuries. We want to know if they have chronic health conditions. We want to know if they are on any medications. So musculoskeletal injuries, obviously it's very important. We're going to see a slide at the very end today. And this is a good thing to always remember. It's very important to make sure that you do not dive in to like a new exercise routine while your client is like actively injured. Good way to think about this, and you should steal this explanation, because sometimes you'll get people who, they'll pull a hamstring, pull calf, pull something, and all of us in here have probably experienced some version of a muscle pull here and there. And you get a little bit of temporary relief when you do stretch. Like if I pulled my hamstring, right, I might like do a little like just lean over, a little gentle hamstring stretch there, right? I'm just kind of like, and I'm like, oh, that does feel good, right? And I get a little temporary relief from that pain, but you don't want to do that. You really don't want to do a series of stretches for a muscle that is like a strained muscle. I mean, think about like what a muscle strain is, right? Let's just go ahead and pull up use grades whenever you're talking about muscle strains, by the way. So grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. So you look here, and it's like, or this is a sprain, I guess. I'll pull up a strain. Sprains and strains are the same, by the way. The difference is a strain is in a muscle and a sprain is in a ligament. But you look and you can see, like, here's the idea. Like grade 1 is like some minor damage. Grade 2 is like there's probably some actual tearing, and grade 3 is detached. But you'll get people who have like a strained muscle. They'll have like this going on, and so they'll stretch, and that stretching pulls this part of it pulls the whole thing apart, but it like creates some length here and here in those fibers, which is why it leads to some temporary relief. Turns your nervous system off from, because it's damaged, it's probably spasming, right? Which means it's probably trying to like protect itself now and contract, right? And so by, doing some light stretching, that is creating some length. That creation of length makes it feel a lot better. It feel a lot better, even though it may not actually be functioning a lot better, right? So there's your problem, right? But here's the other thing that people don't really consider. It's like, well, you may be getting temporary relief by turning that off a little bit, but what you're doing is you're taking a tissue that is torn and you're pulling it apart. And like people forget that like this muscle's bleeding, right? The blood vessels and all that are torn inside there. So like you want it to scab over, right? You wouldn't take like a cut on your arm, grab the skin from one side and the other side, and then pull it apart, would you? I mean, that would be a crazy thing to do if you had like a slice on your arm. It's equally crazy to do the same thing in your muscles. So we don't want to, like, if they have a current musculoskeletal injury, obviously we don't want, but if they have a past musculoskeletal injury that has had time to heal and is no longer actively bleeding, it's well scar tissued over, yeah, we want to create some length there. So that's going to tell me what to look for when I get into the rest of the session, get into my movement assessments and stuff. So yeah, we love questions about past injuries. Past surgeries obviously leads to scar tissue as well. Any chronic health conditions can allow me to sort of like target my workouts towards the things that improve that chronic health condition. Now, it is crazy important as well, responsibility wise, that you do not, you obviously do not treat medical conditions, and do not say that you treat medical conditions. Now, the best example, the one I always use, is diabetes. It is possible that through exercise, somebody can get off insulin and their blood sugar can go back into a normal range and they can have really good blood sugar control again if they start engaging in like an exercise routine, So did exercise cure their diabetes? No, but it did get their symptoms to essentially zero, to where they don't necessarily need that medicine anymore. So I would never say that I can treat or cure diabetes, but I will absolutely talk about how like diabetics who begin exercising, can absolutely reverse some of the negative effects associated with type 2 diabetes. And type 2 is the one we're talking about here. Same thing is true of heart disease, right? We know that it has a positive impact on it, but it'd be crazy for us to say like, oh yeah, we'll treat your heart disease through exercise. Like we can make you generally healthier through exercise, and then your heart disease no longer becomes a problem. That's a much better way to say it, but that's not how we do it. And then medications. You want to know about medications because they do have impacts on your client. So if you look at like the effects of medications, there is a table in every edition of your textbooks that looks like this, maybe a different color. But basically, you want to get kind of familiar with generally the effects of these. You don't have to have these memorized, by the way, but you want to know how to be able to like find them and look them up. So if your client says, what is the most common beta blocker out there? Probably I actually don't really know any of those. Oh, propanol. Yeah, propanol. So yeah, you'll see like your client will say, well, I'm on this thing, and they'll list out their medications and stuff. And so you'll find that and be like, okay, great. And then we know that beta blockers lower heart rate and blood pressure. So now when you're training your client, it's gonna be pretty important to make sure that like you are, not being like, oh, you're killing it today. Your heart rate's super low, like, and then just crank that, treadmill up to 1,000, like be aware if they are on medications, like what some of the effects can be. Just look them up. You don't have to have them memorized, but you want to be able to look them up. So yeah, that is, oh, and then finally at the very end, your additional like notes section here. So this is where you're probably going to get into SMART goals. This is where I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. Make some space here. And let's get over here. Starting one. So back to the PowerPoint finally. We do the physical readiness with the PAR-Q. We do our general lifestyle questionnaire and eventually into medical history. And then we want to get familiar with what our clients' goals are, right? So goal setting is obviously, like I said, it's a huge part of exercise in general, but we want to use the SMART goal system. And what a SMART goal is, it is a goal setting system designed to make goals more objective, measurable, and attainable. Actually, we'll just say specific. So we see here, our first one is we want to make sure that our goals are specific. And specific means that we want to be very clear. I'm going to do that all once again. Be very clear about like what our client is actually trying to achieve, right? So client goals should be very clear about what it is they are trying to achieve, right? So that's when we say like a specific goal. So again, not losing weight, but losing fat, not gaining muscle, but gaining strength, right? Those two things are somewhat related, but like not always exactly the same. Somebody tells me when they gain muscle, I'm imagining that they want to do a hypertrophy workout, but they might be imagining that they want to have increased strength. Be able to run better, right? Not very clear, but if you say run a 5K, that's very different than running a 10, marathon or ultra marathon, or, running faster could also be a totally different thing, right? So that's when we say like a goal, we want it to be very specific. We also want to make sure that it is measurable, right? Measurable goals are goals should have an objective way to measure success, right? That's going to be good. We want to make sure that like we are, typically this means like putting a number on it. It doesn't always have to be a number necessarily, but what we don't want to have is just like if somebody said they want to be rich, right? First off, that's already not very specific. But like I don't know how to measure that. Even though money is very like number oriented, I don't know what your definition of rich is. If you told me you wanted to be a millionaire, you want to have $1 million in savings, that's crazy. Yeah, now it's very measurable. I know exactly what I need to do to get you there. Attainable, right? Attainable goals are actionable goals is one. It's another term that I like to use. Those I'll sometimes say, instead of saying attainable, I'll say actionables, but like goals should be very actionable. The client should know what actions to take to attain their goal. So again, like a good goal is almost, when I say it's almost instructive, I mean that it's attainable, right? It tells me, just based on hearing it, sort of what actions I need to take in order to get there. Realistic goals should obviously be achievable in a realistic fashion related to that client. So again, like, it's not impossible to lose, 10 pounds in a week. It happens. You hear stories about it online. Is it realistic for your client though to do in like a healthy way, right? A lot of that, if you lose 10 pounds in a week, it's probably a lot of water weight. It's mostly like dumping out your glycogen. And you're probably being incredibly physically active, and dedicating your entire day to this like one thing, probably on like some version of like a fast or something like that, right? And then like exercising like a maniac. That's probably not realistic for 99% of people out there, So we want to make sure that we are setting like a goal that is a little bit more realistic, right? Me wanting to become, we use golf, becoming a PGA golfer. Probably not a realistic goal, but getting, what do they call it, a handicap, 2 strokes off my handicap, like that's probably much more realistic. And then timely goals should have a deadline. Deadlines are like a freaking superpower. They are incredibly good for you. We want to make sure that like, when you put a deadline on something, it makes you way more, able to track like whether or not you are on the path of meeting your goal or not, and it lights a fire under your butt to actually get it done, So, those are our SMART goals. Those are all things you kind of want to get familiar with. So, I like to take in a first session, I'll get a client to tell me a couple of their goals, and then I'll be like, these are really great. Let's reword these. If you ever, I'll ask them, have you ever worked with SMART goals before? Let's see if we can reword these and make them just a little bit more specific and instructional. And then give them a deadline. Love a deadline. Deadline's my favorite. This is my favorite out of the system. And obviously, like with all this, this is setting you up for your first session. You do have a scope of practice that you want to work within. Make sure that you are not working outside of your scope of practice or your code of conduct. And then make sure that like you are keeping records of all of this stuff, and make sure that you are not sharing those records, with anybody else. And then there are times when you do need to know when to refer out, things that you shouldn't be doing. If your client is experiencing any actual swelling, that's a big deal. Send them to a professional. Any acute pain, like musculoskeletal pain, they are dealing with right now, again, they shouldn't be exercising. And then if you have any doubt, like if you don't know, it's like, well, maybe maybe I can still work with them. If that is your instinct, that is a bad instinct. You are opening yourself up for risk, and you are also, possibly putting your client at risk. If you are not 100% positive that it is safe for you to work with that client, well, then you probably shouldn't be working with that client right now. So always err on the side of caution, and just make sure that keep your client as safe as possible. That is our main responsibility there. I'm trying to open up chapter 8. Any questions, comments, or concerns on all of this subjective stuff?
Nope.
All righty.
Clear.
Love it. All right, let me save the photo. These notes from this one, chapter 7. Sweet. I just closed my window. Hold on. Where did I go? Oh no. Gallery. I gotta turn screen share off and then turn it back on. There we are. I've never hit that button before. Okay. Close that and open up my other notes. Assessments. All righty. So let's talk about some movement distortions. Now we got some really good videos to show you guys. These are great. So we're looking at static assessment. So this is going to be your client's alignment statically, right? It is the alignment. It's how they look standing still, you know, because if we see that, we probably will see there is some version of dysfunction. It's important to make sure that like we are correctly aligned, right? So after we're done moving through, you know, all of our client intake stuff, it's like, all right, let's get them out of the chair. Let's get them onto the gym floor and let's start taking a look at like how they might be moving. Because if they're coming to you for corrective exercise, they probably have some aches and pains. Let's see if we can get an idea of why they have those aches and pains. So I want to explain the function of static posture, the relationship of alignment and neuromuscular control, how lifestyle factors are affecting that, how to perform the actual friggin' assessment. We'll practice that on Tuesday. And then get into some of these understanding, like, you know, start working on memorizing our muscle imbalances and what they mean. Here's the nice thing, guys. If you do a static assessment, we're gonna see two major types of static malalignment today. We're going to see what are called Jonda's postural distortions, and then we're also going to see Kendall's posture types. They're kind of the same thing. Like this lordotic one here is the same thing as this one here. They were just kind of the two, you know, there's two different people who have spent like their careers basically analyzing static posture. So we're going to see some serious similarities between the two, which is great. You know, like we're covering both. So, you know, if you see like an anterior pelvic, if you don't see an anterior pelvic tilt in a static assessment, like they have good posture, but then you do see it in the overhead squat, it means the same thing. The muscles are the same because again, like the muscles that are causing anterior rotation are the same. It's not specific to the assessment. It's specific to the movement impairment, right? So we're going to start with static because, like, you know, if it's out of alignment statically, it's certainly going to be out of alignment under dynamic movement. So we want to start with this. This is our first section here. So posture obviously is crazy alignment. We say like what your static posture is, the alignment of the kinetic chain at rest. So we want to have ideal posture, right? We want to have good alignment where there's an equal amount of movement on both sides of the joint. Right here, what we're seeing is like a tight muscle on one side of a joint and a weak muscle on the other side of the joint. So we are experiencing pattern overload, or we could experience like injury, right? So we kind of look at like, you know, what's going on. We're going to explain each of these little concepts individually. We might be experiencing a little bit of reciprocal inhibition, right? Or it should say altered. We've got altered reciprocal inhibition, right? So what do we mean by that? Well, let's go back. What is reciprocal inhibition? Reciprocal inhibition is, you know, a natural way that your nervous system is organized, right? When I contract one muscle, the antagonist muscle is supposed to relax. When I contract that muscle, its antagonist is supposed to relax, right? So regular, reciprocal inhibition is like I contract my biceps, my triceps let go. I contract my glutes, my hip flexors let go. But altered reciprocal inhibition is where that doesn't happen. I contract my glutes and my hip flexors are like, well, we also want to keep contracting. It's like, no. I'm using the glutes right now. You're supposed to let go. And the hip flexors like, too bad. I like being in this shortened contracted state because that is how I spend most of the day, we sit all day long, right? So this is where an antagonist muscle doesn't relax when the agonist tries to contract, right? So there's our altered reciprocal inhibition. Another way to say that's a layman's definition. The actual definition from your textbook is a tight agonist decreases the neural drive to its functional antagonist. And I always dislike the way they lay this. They say agonist and then there's antagonist. That is still correct, but I've always kind of disliked it because I'm like, I want to talk about the muscle that I want to fire. But yeah, basically a tight muscle, in this case, this is the muscle we're talking about, so that's the tight one, decreases the neural drive to its antagonist, which is the muscle I want to get turned on. I want this muscle to do its job. So tight hip flexors decrease my gluteus maximus. Tight gastrocnemius decreases the neural drive to my anterior tibialis. Tight adductors decrease the neural drive to my gluteus medius, my abductors, right? So that's altered reciprocal inhibition. Now, what's going to happen in response to that is we are going to get synergistic dominance, right? And synergistic dominance is where we're going to get a synergist muscle takes over for a weakened or inhibited prime mover. So now my synergist muscle tries to take over, right? Let's say we went through 3 examples. We said, well, actually, let's lay those out here, right? So we see a little bit of movement dysfunction. Let's say we see excessive. We'll say we saw 3 examples, right? We saw excessive hip flexion, right? And then we also saw excessive plantar flexion in the calf, and we saw excessive adduction in the adductors, right? So there's we'll label this our static malalignment. That's what we observed, right? And then over here, we'll put a little table. We're going to say that this is altered reciprocal. So what muscle is, excessively, contracting, right? We'll say that's excessive. We'll say excessive concentric, right? So that's what we're going to say here. And then that's our example we'll put in this column. And then what we're seeing over here, our other column, is synergistic dominance. That's also excessive concentric. Right, so we'll put that here. So we have excessive hip flexion, which means we have tight, overactive hip flexors, right? So that means that now my hamstrings might take over synergistically instead of using the muscle that I want to use, which would be my gluteus maximus, right? I have excessive plantar flexion. That's going to be a tight gastrocnemius or maybe a soleus, right? So there's my excessive plantar flexion. And what I should have been using was, those, those muscles are keeping my anterior tibialis from doing its job. So now I might try to find some other muscle that like takes over and tries to do the job of my anterior tibialis. I might get synergistic peroneals to come in and take over. And now they're tight as well. And that's just going to cause eversion instead of dorsiflexion, which is what I wanted. I might have excessive adduction where my adductors are really, really tight. And they are squeezing harder than I want them to. So you know what muscle like tries to do abduction, which is the opposite of adduction? My inhibited, oh, you know what I should do? I could put another column down here. The muscle that I like want to use is my gluteus medius. But the TFL, which is mostly a hip flexor and an internal rotator, it does do just some like really bad, kind of weak abduction. It's not great at it, but it's going to try to take over. My tensor fascia latae there is going to try to come in and take over, right? So we're seeing, I'm going to add another column here, right? We are using way too much. It's altered reciprocal, right? We have this like, excessive concentric, but we have this like, limited, limited concentric or excessive eccentric, if you want to think of it as that, right? So it's like limited concentric right here. You can consider it excessive eccentric as well. This muscle that's not contracting the way we want it to. That's where we're getting this altered reciprocal inhibition, right? So again, like now I've got, my glutes are not firing because my hip flexors are firing. My anterior tibialis is not firing because my gastrocnemius is firing. My gluteus medius is not firing because my adductors are firing, right? So there's our little, we got a little table here. Kind of explaining what's going on, which muscles, these tight muscles are inhibiting their antagonists over here. So then these synergists are further inhibiting these antagonists over here. So that's how reciprocal inhibition and synergistic dominance lead to bad movement patterns. Bad movement patterns leads to arthrokinematic, meaning joint movement dysfunction. So joint movement dysfunction. And then we have decreased neuromuscular control, right? Which this is the brain no longer learning how to do things the right way. So we have like joint problems, rubbing, grinding, whatever. And then we have the brain not knowing how to do this correctly. So that's why we got to look at the static alignment, because we want to know what's going on here. What we end up with is a muscle imbalance, an overactive muscle on one side of the joint and an underactive muscle on the other side of the joint. So, in this case, overactive, and underactive. So overactive, and underactive, right? We need to get those muscles to fire correctly. So we see a little bit of reciprocal inhibition causes synergistic dominance, which then causes improper joint movement and pain. And then we end up with decreased neuromuscular control. The body learns the wrong way to do it, but it gets used to doing it that way. And that's what leads to another term you'll sometimes hear. We call it relative flexibility, right? We kind of talked about, Lisa, I think you asked yesterday about this, but we kind of talked about it yesterday. It's like somebody who, gets really overactive in their QL. So they bend over to pick something up like this. Like instead of being able to like squat down and like grab something, they might get used to like reaching for stuff like side to side. You'll get this like really bad QL activity, or twisting, right? Or just like rounded back motion. So you get this like excessive spinal movement when what we want is spinal stability. So we call that relative flexibility. It's like, well, I got the job done. It's like, yeah, like relative to doing it the wrong way, So here's some common ones in the upper body. You know, generally, guys, as this is a crazy general rule of thumb, the most common overactive muscles, you know, they're going to be these in this column over here, and are commonly underactive muscles. So if you did want to just like write a couple canned workouts are just like pre-mades. You just throw in some warm-up stuff where you generally stretch these things over here, and you generally throw in some strengthening exercises for these over here. They're probably going to be better than most, you know, general workouts out there, because you're already at least focused on taking the time to turn off these things that, you know, most people have really tight: levator scaps, upper traps, sternocleidomastoid, that, you know, big three, boom, 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 right? And then also like scalenes are there as well, kind of underneath the upper traps. So it's like these four here, just most of us have like tight neck muscles, you know. You tell your clients to take 5 minutes before they go to bed and just stretch these things out. They're probably going to sleep a little bit better, and you know, they're probably going to reduce the likelihood of things like tension headaches. You want to get a little bit more specific than that, we can get into, well, most people need some deep hip, you know, deep cervical flexor strengthening, right? That double chin movement is pretty good for most people, you know. So I will say, I think it's actually a little weird that NASM put these tables in here. NASM's like really big on not doing general stuff, you know, but generally you foam roll and stretch this side. You generally do some strengthening exercises for this side. You're going to be in pretty good shape. And the same thing is true of the lower body. Most people have weak glutes. Most people have weak stabilizing abdominal muscles, or even just like rectus abdominis muscles. This is an interesting one. Like normally I would say this belongs over here. But generally you work on a lot of this, right? And you stretch out a lot of this, you're probably going to be in a pretty good spot. So before we get into, you know, Jonda and Kendall, let's watch a quick little video here that's going to kind of explain everything that I
stand up.
And we got a new instructor here. We're taking a break from Rick for a second. She's really great.
Straight, don't slouch, shoulders back, stand up straight, don't slouch, shoulders back, head up. How many times did your mother say that when you were a kid? Well, I'm saying it again. And you're not a kid, and last time I checked, I'm not your mother. Posture matters. There's a lot more to posture than balance and gait. In fact, a client's posture can give you important clues about their overall muscular health. Posture directly influences movement quality and risk of injury, for better or worse. As a corrective exercise specialist, your task is to assess posture and to help improve it to increase mobility, performance, and to increase resistance to injury. There are two kinds of posture: static and dynamic. Static posture is how we hold ourselves in a stance, reflected in our body alignment. Static posture forms the foundation for the function of our extremities. And just like a house, a weak foundation can cause problems in other areas. The second type of posture is dynamic posture. This is the body position we maintain while performing tasks such as reaching, lifting, twisting, squatting. A dynamic postural assessment can be used to identify muscle imbalances. A muscle imbalance is an alteration in the functional relationship between pairs or groups of muscles. An assessment can pinpoint problem areas. This will help you to create an individualized plan to optimize movement and reduce risk of injury. What causes muscle imbalances? Several factors can cause changes in joint alignment, including the quality and function of myofascial tissue. Myofascial tissue is the connective tissue in and around muscles and tendons. When muscle imbalances occur, the body will compensate and will work less efficiently. When this happens, some muscles become overactive. Overactive muscles tend to be short. Other muscles are underactive. Underactive muscles tend to be long and continuously stretched out of shape, which impacts their work capacity. So posture is not an isolated issue. It affects body alignment, which in turn influences movement. That's why posture must be addressed in order to encourage optimal alignment of the human movement system. When assessing a client, keep these common causes of postural imbalance in mind. First, habitual movement patterns. One client may be hunched over a computer all day. Another may carry a 40-pound toddler on her hip. These seemingly innocuous behaviors may cause significant challenges. Second, altered movement patterns from repetitive movement. Walter is a house painter and spends 8 to 10 hours a day using a roller in his right arm. Sylvia is retired and hits the tennis courts 5 times a week. Amir hits the gym regularly but tends to focus on his shoulders and biceps. This creates an imbalance that hampers smooth, coordinated movement. Letitia took a spill off her bike during a triathlon. Mario took a tumble down the steps in his home. Certainly, you'll see many clients with compromised movement due to injury, and sometimes those injuries may require surgery. But remember, surgeries and medical procedures of all kinds may result in altered movement patterns. Whoever said that time heals all wounds was not a corrective exercise specialist. You'll see clients with old injuries that continue to rear their ugly heads in the form of compromised movement. So you can see that once again, your mom was right. Posture does matter, and there's a lot more to it. Posture tells a story about a client's health, her history, his muscular strength and weaknesses, and will support you as the architect of a goal-oriented plan. With a focus on optimal movement, efficient performance, and injury resistance, you'll elevate your client's fitness plans from so-so to superior.
Okay. One more. Straight into the next one, please.
When evaluating your client's static posture, you're going to want to look at them from the front, side, and rear view. To begin, we'll review what ideal posture looks like from each of these positions, and then we'll go through some of the different postural classifications that you might encounter with your clients. When evaluating your client from each of these positions, we're going to be referencing the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. So let's start by discussing what ideal posture looks like from the front view. We'll begin at the feet and work our way up. So ideal posture at the foot and ankle is going to be the toes pointed straight ahead and feet parallel to each other. Let's go ahead and turn your toes in a little bit for me. And at the arch, we want the arches neutral. So a neutral arch is going to be not completely flattened, not completely raised up, but somewhere right in the middle. Moving up to the knees, ideal alignment of the knee is going to be the patella in line with the second and third toe. Moving up to the lumbopelvic hip complex, you want to look to make sure that the weight is evenly distributed between the right and left sides of the body. From there, we're going to move on up to the shoulders, and here we just want to look to make sure the shoulders are level and in neutral alignment. And last, you want to look at the head. You want to make sure that the head is in neutral alignment, and this is a good opportunity to see if it's rotated or laterally flexed to one side. Once you've observed your client's static posture from the front, then you want to look at them from the side view. So we're going to have Lauren rotate here. And from the lateral view or side view, ideal posture at the foot and ankle is going to be not excessively plantar flexed or dorsiflexed. We just want a nice neutral position at that foot and ankle complex. At the knees, we want a relatively soft knee. So here's a good opportunity for you to see if the knees are hyperextended or overly flexed. Moving on up to the lumbopelvic hip complex, we want to see what is the orientation of the pelvis in the sagittal plane. Is there an excessive anterior pelvic tilt or excessive posterior pelvic tilt? Ideally, we want a nice neutral position right in the middle. From there, we're going to go up to the shoulders. And the shoulders we want to be in neutral alignment as well. So this is a good opportunity to see if the shoulders are excessively rounded forward, if they're excessively retracted, or if they're nice and ideal, kind of stacked right in the middle. If we were to drop a plumb line from the shoulders, they should kind of fall right through the hips. And then lastly, we're going to look at the head alignment. Head should be neutral, not excessively extended or flexed forward. And the ear, a good point of reference would be to have the ear right in line with the shoulder and hip. Now, the final position you're going to observe your client's static posture from is the rear view. So once you've assessed them from the side, you want your client to rotate, or you can walk.
This is what's new. We don't do a posterior view in the standard edition book.
Around your client to evaluate their posture from the back. So here's a good opportunity at the foot and ankle to ensure that they have a nice neutral position at the arch. Oftentimes, if a client has an excessively flattened arch or raised arch, it's much easier to see that from the rear view than from the front view. So ideally, we want a nice neutral position. We don't want the foot excessively flattened. We don't want the arch excessively raised. Then we want to move up to the knees. We want a nice neutral position at the knees. So again, we're looking to see, is there excessive flexion at the knee, or are the knees hyperextended? Moving on up to the pelvis, we want to make sure that the weight is evenly distributed between the right and left sides of the body. You can also look to see if there's any rotation occurring in the transverse plane at the lumbopelvic hip complex. Moving up from the lumbopelvic hip complex, you're going to be looking at the shoulders from the rear view. This is a good opportunity to see that the shoulders are level and not elevated. And you also want to take this as an opportunity to look at the shoulder blades or scapulae. We want to make sure that in this position, there's no winging on either one side or both sides. And lastly, you're going to want to look at head position. From here, you just want to make sure that it's not laterally flexed or rotated to one side.
All right. So we have finished our PAR-Q. We have finished our general medical history and lifestyle questionnaire. And now we are going to move on to looking at our kinetic chain. So we have 5 key kinetic chain checkpoints. We're going to look at the foot and ankle complex to see if it's in alignment. Ideal alignment is what we saw in the video. Toes should be pointed straight forward. There should be a natural arch in the foot. Then we can take a look at the knee. They shouldn't be excessively internally rotated or adducted, or excessively externally rotated or abducted. Either of those are bad. We want that knee to track over the second and third toe. A lot of people think it's like supposed to be your big toe because it's kind of our navigator and stuff, but you do want it actually over the very center of the foot. Everybody's gonna be a little bit different there, but for the most part, we want it to line up, directly there. Then we want to take a look at the lumbopelvic hip complex. It's not laterally shifting if we're looking from the front or the back, and it's not anteriorly or posteriorly tilted if we are looking from the side. Shoulders and thoracic spine, we want to see that shoulders are in line with our ear. So like directly lined up there, just with like the back of the ear right there. And then we also want to make sure that they're not excessively like rounding forward. So it's not just that it's like pulled back and retracted, it's also not hunched forward, right? And then we also want to take a look at the head and make sure it is in a neutral position, not shifting over to either side or in that forward alignment. So we take a look here, level, take a look here, level. And then also pay attention to the space between your scapula and your thoracic spine. That space should be somewhat equal between the two. If it happens to be wider on one side or the other, they might have a slight rounding on one side of the shoulders, or they might have like, they're experiencing a little bit of like what we call scoliosis, right? Which is a lateral shift of the spine. So our first version of distortion that we're going to see is Jonda's postural distortions. There's going to be 4 big ones here, really 3 big ones here. We're going to see upper cross syndrome, which is characterized by rounded shoulders and a forward head posture. By the way, these make really good test questions, so get familiar with these definitions. But upper crossed syndrome, classic one, rounded shoulders and a forward head posture. And the reason we call it crossed syndrome is basically with this, you are going to have, you sort of picture a circle here, right? You've got overactive tight muscles here and here, and underactive weak muscles here and here. And so it makes this X posture, right? This like tight to tight, weak to weak thing. And so with that, that's what we mean. So when we take a look at Jonda's, where are you? Upper cross syndrome, it looks like this, right? We see, oh no, I might need to open this up in Paint. Yeah, bye. All right, so what we see is weakened, well, actually let's start with the tight. So we see tight muscles in the levator scapula. It's gonna be right back here. We see tight muscles in the sternocleidomastoid, which, to be fair, is actually running like more back here. That's why it's on the backside. I know most of your sternocleidomastoids. The cross syndrome thing is not perfect in this analogy, but it does run back here, so it does, come to the back. So we see tight there, and then scalenes as well. So like right here under the upper traps as well. So there's your kind of big 3 tight areas. I'm going to highlight those just so you guys can see them as technically separate muscles there. So these are all very tight, right? And then we also see a lot of tightness causing this. We see that's giving us this forward head posture, right? But we also see we've got rounded shoulders. So that's our definition. We go back, right? It's static posture characterized by rounded shoulders and a forward head posture. So the forward head posture is coming from this, and the rounded shoulders are coming from the pectoralis major, which is really like all of this, right? Then we also see the pectoralis minor. Pectoralis minor running a little bit differently, more at like an upward angle, kind of like this. You know, obviously that's hidden by your pec major, like it's a deep muscle. And then we also see like a tight latissimus dorsi. Now that one's a little surprising, but it's running up here and it grabs onto the humerus, right? I guess a bit more like that. So that's causing this internal rotation, which we do get from our latissimus dorsi. The teres major in the actual like kind of rotator cuff area back here, again running to the front, almost sharing, but not quite, an insertion with the lats there. And then even the coracobrachialis there, this little shorty muscle kind of in the bicep. That one's gonna be a little bit less commonly mentioned, but we do see a little bit of tightness there as well. So those are all tight and they're all pulling way harder than they should be, causing this rounded shoulders, right? So now we've got our internally rotated and rounded shoulders coming from these tight muscles over here. So yeah, so that is what's going on there. So we need to take this, you know, the way we're going to fix this is eventually going through like our corrective exercise continuum. We're going to inhibit the overactive muscle through SMR, right? So we might use a tool to get back and loosen up the levator scapula, the sternocleidomastoid, which you can do with like manual massage, the upper trapezius, maybe like a Theracane, a foam roller on the latissimus dorsi, right? A lacrosse ball on the pec minor, where we're going to get in there and loosen up all of those muscles so that we can then switch to and then follow that up with stretches for those same muscles. So the upper trapezius, the levator scapula, the sternocleidomastoid, right? The lats, the pectorals, the teres major, right? Loosening all of those up through static stretches or PNF stretches. And then eventually activating our underactive stuff, those deep cervical flexors, working on, you know, keeping our chin tucked. The posterior deltoid, maybe something like reverse flies, the middle trapezius, lower trapezius, and rhomboids through something like rows, and then the rotator cuff through some version of external rotation like we did yesterday. And then eventually we can get into an integrated dynamic movement like a step up to shoulder press, you know, or a reverse lunge to row, something where we might be able to, or a squat to row, you know, something relatively complicated. So we won't go over like examples of it, but that's how we're going to sort of address this upper cross syndrome. We're also going to see, actually, I think there's a video for that. Hold on. Let's do each of these individually. Come on. I think I got this right. I think, is it the, okay, hold on. In here? Yeah. All right.
Now let's discuss some of
Let's take a look at what these actually like look like. So there's our first one, and then we'll let him kind of talk for a minute, and then we'll go through the rest of them.
the different postural classifications that you might see when evaluating your client's static posture. The first one that we'll go through is pes planus. A client with pes planus posture is going to display the following alignment. At the ankle joints, you might observe excessive pronation. So in this case, we can see with Lauren that her feet are turned out and the arches are collapsed in. At the knees, you might observe excessive valgus or adduction, internal rotation, and flexion. Moving up to the hips, you might also observe excessive internal rotation And then at the pelvis, you might observe an excessive anterior tilt, where it's tipped forward and the lumbar spine is arched excessively. Conversely, you might have a client who displays pes cavus, which essentially is the opposite alignment from the pes planus classification we just covered. A client with pes cavus is going to display the following alignment. At the ankle joints, you might notice excessive supination, where the arches are excessively raised and the weight is kind of distributed on the outside of the feet. Moving up to the knees, you might notice a varus position where the knees are adducted and extended. Moving up to the hips might be in more of an externally rotated position. And then at the pelvis, from the lateral view, you might observe more of a posterior pelvic tilt where the lumbar spine is flattened out and the pelvis is tucked underneath. Another postural classification that you might see when evaluating your client's static posture is lower cross syndrome. Lower cross syndrome deals with malalignments primarily at the pelvis, lumbar spine, and thoracic spine. However, you might see compensations at the other joints that we discussed. For example, the ankle joints may be neutral or plantar flexed. The knee joints may be flexed or hyperextended, and the hip joints might be flexed or neutral. However, in lower cross syndrome, the pelvis will likely display an anterior pelvic tilt. So you'll see that pelvis tipped forward. The lumbar spine is going to be hyperlordotic. So there's going to be an excessive curve in the lumbar spine and potentially a lateral shift to one side or the other. And then moving up to the thoracic spine, as mentioned previously, is going to be affected as well, where you may see hyperkyphosis or an excessive rounding of the thoracic spine. Your client may also display compensation at the cervical spine by way of excessive extension. So they may have a neutral or normal cervical spine position, or they might be hyperextended. And then the head may be neutral or it might be forward. So again, with lower cross syndrome, you're going to see compensations most likely at the pelvis, lumbar spine, and thoracic spine. Another postural classification that you might observe when evaluating your client's static posture is upper cross syndrome. Unlike lower cross syndrome, upper cross syndrome is going to deal primarily with the upper body. With this postural classification, your client may display malalignments in the lumbar spine, or they may have normal neutral alignment. The primary thing you're going to observe with upper cross syndrome is at the shoulders and cervical spine. So we'll have Lauren rotate here. At the shoulders, your client's going to display rounded and or elevated shoulders. They may also display scapular winging in this position. The thoracic spine is going to be hyperkyphotic, so they're going to have excessive rounding in the thoracic spine. And then at the cervical spine, you're going to notice hyperextension. So typically your clients will display a forward head posture and an excessive lordotic curve at the cervical spine. You might also observe the postural classification referred to as Laird syndrome or kyphosis lordosis posture. A good way to think about kyphosis lordosis posture is that it's essentially a combination of lower cross syndrome and upper cross syndrome. So as mentioned previously with lower cross syndrome, you may see malalignments at the foot, ankle, knee, and hip joints, but it's primarily going to affect the pelvis, lumbar spine, and thoracic spine. And then as we mentioned with upper cross syndrome, you're going to see compensations through the thoracic spine, scapular winging, perhaps elevated shoulders, and a forward head and hyperextended cervical spine. A client with lordotic posture is going to display components of lower cross syndrome, but also malalignments in the lower extremity. At the ankle joints, you're going to notice that they're slightly plantar flexed. That plantar flexion at the ankle is going to lead to slight hyperextension at the knees. So essentially their weight is going to shift rearward in the lower extremity. Moving up to the hips are going to be flexed and the pelvis is going to be anteriorly rotated. So essentially their lower body is going to be shifted rearward and their upper body is going to be shifted slightly forward. The pelvis is anteriorly rotated, which then will create hyperlordosis or excessive extension in the lumbar spine. Conversely, you may encounter a client who displays flat back posture. So unlike the lordotic posture, they're going to display almost exactly the opposite alignment in the lower extremity, pelvis, and lumbar spine. In a client with flat back posture, you may notice that their ankle joints are neutral and or slightly plantar flexed. The knee joints are going to be extended. The hip joint will be extended. However, the pelvis is going to be aligned in a posterior tilt. So we'll see the pelvis kind of tucked underneath. And then moving up to the lumbar spine as a result of that posterior pelvic tilt, we'll see hypolordosis or a flattening in the lumbar spine. From there, moving on to the thoracic spine, we may see hyperkyphosis in the upper region of the thoracic spine and a flattening in the lower region of the thoracic spine. Lastly, at the head and neck, we may see a hyperextended cervical spine and a forward head position. And the last postural classification that we'll discuss and that you may encounter with your clients is referred to as sway back posture. A client with sway back posture is going to display hyperextension at the knee joints. So we're going to see those knees fully locked out and hyperextended. They'll also display hyperextension at the hip joints. However, moving up to the pelvis, they're going to display a posterior pelvic tilt. And then moving on up to the lumbar spine, they'll display hypolordosis as a result. However, in a client with sway back posture, while they display a posterior pelvic tilt and hypolordosis in the lumbar spine, you're going to notice a posterior displacement of their thoracic spine. So their weight is going to be shifted rearward, but their spine is going to be curved forward. So they're going to have hyperkyphosis in terms of their curvature in the thoracic spine, but they're going to be shifting their weight rearward. And then lastly, when we move up to the head and cervical spine, they'll display hyperextension at the cervical spine with forward head displacement.
So this is static posture, so we can take a look at each of those and see sort of just like an image of that. So if we look, oh, hold on, back up here. So we look at if we look at upper crossed syndrome, right? We're going to see, again, we say upper cross because it's making like, you know, tight to tight, weak to weak here, right? And so we see this rounded shoulders, forward head posture. In lower crossed, we see the anterior pelvic tilt, that classic, like, you know, excessive, that's not a very good exaggeration, that excessive lumbar arch there. So again, tight spinal erectors and tight hip flexors, weak abdominals, and weak hip extensors, so glutes and hamstrings actually. Then we'll also oftentimes see pronation distortion syndrome or pes planus syndrome, where we'll see the flattened feet and adducted knees. So see, it comes kind of together here. So foot flattening as well as like adduction and internal rotation. No, actually, I just forget. I totally forgot to show you the picture of lower crossed. So there's our lower cross syndrome. You get the anterior pelvic tilt, right? Again, we're seeing poor spinal stabilization and poor hip extension, excessive hip flexion, and excessive spinal extension. So, you know, tight muscles and weak muscles, right? Which is what all of this comes down to. And then pronation distortion syndrome, sometimes called pes planus. Where'd you go? There it is. So this is a little bit different. I get the images here. The red is the tight stuff. We're seeing excessive hip internal rotation. We're seeing excessive adduction, excessive tibial external rotation, and excessive foot pronation. Limited, all the opposites of those things, right? Not enough external rotation in the hips, not enough abduction, not enough tibial internal rotation, not enough supination, right? All that stuff is going to get us neutral. So you can see our arrows are basically all going in the opposite directions there. So again, like weak muscles on one side of the joint, tight muscles on the other. So that's, and then layered cross is where you put lower and upper together. So you're going to see somebody who has the excessive anterior pelvic tilt, but then also still rounds their shoulders, which will sometimes give you the illusion that they're like neutral, you know? But obviously, like, you know, we want to look at those things in isolation. So, okay, we got tight here and tight here. That's if you have somebody with layered crossed, or, you know, which a lot of people will be, you know, a really good workout type that works for them is, you know, a total body workout, but you do a mostly upper body warm up and a mostly lower body warm up, sort of alternating. And then Kendall's is kind of the same thing, but, you know, different person, slightly different opinions. So, you know, kind of the same sort of definition here. You know, it's a series of alignments. But we see lordotic posture, that's the anterior pelvic tilt. So we go back to like this idea of lower cross syndrome, but Kendall does a better job of including two other postures that you're not going to see as often. The sway back posture, where we see this. Now, this is somebody who is very similar to, actually, before we do sway back posture, let's do flat back posture. So you'll see this kind of thing where you see the flat back posture or the posterior pelvic tilt, right? And this is where you're going to look at your anterior pelvic tilt and kind of reverse it. Nope, wrong thing. Hold on. So like instead of excessive hip flexion, this person actually has limited hip flexion. Instead of excessive spinal extension, this person actually has limited spinal extension. They're seeing excessive hip extension, usually due to tight hamstring muscles, which are supposed to be a synergist during hip extension, but they start to take over. And I will say you'll oftentimes see it listed as tight abdominals. I don't like that definition personally. I think it is tight rectus abdominis in particular. So that is your cruncher. So with an anterior pelvic tilt, right, we had tight hip flexors pulling down, and we had tight spinal extensors pulling up, giving us this anterior rotation. With somebody who's got a posterior pelvic tilt, we've got tight hamstrings pulling down, and we've actually got tight rectus abdominis muscles pulling up. So giving us that kind of flat back, and then also we're about to get into sway back in a second, posture there. So people will say, oh, your core is too strong. And it's like, oh, I don't like that definition, because it's not that their core is too strong, it's that their crunching muscles are too strong. Their rectus abdominis, the six pack is, the top layer, way too tight, pulling too hard. So whenever they need to stabilize their spine, they crunch their spine instead, right? Just like somebody with an anterior pelvic tilt, instead of stabilizing their spine, they arch their spine instead. So we still need planks with a client with an anterior pelvic tilt and a posterior pelvic tilt. It's important for both because they lack stability. So I get annoyed when I see like fitness influencers and stuff be like, oh yeah, your core's too strong. And I'm like, oh God. Or like your glutes are too strong. Or no. So yeah, that's our flat back posture. And then the sway back posture is the posterior pelvic tilt with the upper body kyphosis, right? So you'll see somebody who has the the posterior flat back, but then they also tend to like shift their weight here, but because that would cause them to fall over, they'll usually round at the top. And so they have this like kind of backwards angle, but they're always kind of walking in there. Which is really, if you're not doing it all day, I gotta say, really hard to balance. It's impressive, even, it's dysfunctional, but it's impressive in its way. So again, that's kind of a combo movement of these two here. And then we do see two other terms, pes planus, which again is coming back to that pronation distortion syndrome, which is a slightly different name for it. And then we also will sometimes run into pes cavis, where you'll actually see sort of bow-legged posture. This one's always hard for me to find on the internet, so I'm just going to show you. So pes planus, right? We have the, feet flatten, and then the knees adduct. So we have this, right? That's that pronation distortion syndrome. Pes cavis, kind of the opposite. You'll actually see the excessive arch. It looks like they're kind of clawing the floor with their toes, and then their knees are kind of caved out. And it kind of looks like they got this like John Wayne walking into a saloon, like, kind of like getting on a horse posture there. My parents are probably somewhere in Washington right now, so excited. Like, Brad mentioned John Wayne. Grew up watching a lot of Westerns. So, so yeah, those are sort of two like foot dysfunctions outside of your normal like pronation distortion syndrome, or, what we see. So I will say this did not very great. I mean, pes cavus is mentioned here. They don't have a great representation of excessive knees cave in or excessive knees cave out. That's going to be a little bit more specific to our squat conversation. So if you're listening to this right now and you're like, I remember us talking about like this, don't worry, we're getting more into that when we get to dynamic assessments starting on Monday. But yeah, those are an introduction. So we're going to get a chance to follow this lesson up on Monday with our overhead squat and dynamic, because here's the thing, they might have good static alignment. So you put a little bit more stress on the body and it all falls apart, right? So that's what we're going to do on Monday. We're going to look at that. And then that'll be what we practice on Tuesday, which will be really, really good. But yeah, how we feel? Any questions on static alignments, guys? We'll see I know it's always kind of hard on Zoom because it's like just looking at pictures. But we're gonna get a chance to see this on Tuesday, and it'll pair really well with our movement stuff. But questions, comments, concerns? Yasmin, Shantice, Trisha, Lisa, how y'all feeling?
Nope. I mean, it was definitely a lot of stuff that we had already repeated for, so
Right?
it's interesting to like have to be reminded of the stuff that we have to review. But no, I think the only thing that was different was the Kendall's posture, if I'm not mistaken.
That's a new term. Yeah, that's one that like, I mean, we covered those things, but like Kendall uses, it's just another person who like kind of made their career out of like studying static posture and stuff. Yande definitely got the popular, because it was like 3 things. It was just easier to break down, and it does kind of cover most of it, but you don't get the like posterior pelvic tilters, and you don't run into them very often, but like, they're out there. So Kendall, covers just a couple of little gaps, but yeah. But yeah, hopefully it's like, hopefully you get a little bit of extra. I want you to walk away today with like a little bit of extra confidence, because you're like, I remember hearing this once before, or twice before, and like it gets, that repetition is just gonna, people are always, I tell my clients this, actually, I'll say this all the time, and they're like, man, it's just like, I feel so good when, you're like, you break this down, and you always know exactly what to do. I'm like, that sounds really impressive, but I've got like 10 moves, like, and it just, those 10 moves work on all humans because we all have the same problems. You're one of 10 distortions, but yeah, hopefully you're starting to get that repetition and you're building your memory of the 10. The 10. I'm making that number up, but all right, so I'm gonna go ahead and kill the recording. Same deal as today's Friday. Today, same deal as Wednesday. I'm gonna reorganize the canvas, get it up. So take a look for that. The video will take a couple hours before YouTube is done judging it or whatever it does. But it'll be up there for you guys to watch later, and we'll be good to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you guys.
Monday.
Have a good weekend.
Oh,
Have a good weekend.
yeah, have a great weekend, guys.
Bye.
Bye.